organized talk. We are more
Okay.
kind of a dialogue.
Thank you very much, Professor Jungar, for your time. Let me start with the first question. Why did the cordon sanitaire fail vis-à-vis the Sweden Democrats while it was successful in the first years of SD's creation?
Yeah, I mean, the isolation was set in place, one could say, when the Sweden Democrats made their electoral or parliamentary breakthrough in 2010. And then it was the prime minister, the conservative politicians, Fredrik Reinfeldt, that stated that the Sweden Democrats should not have any influence over the policy making, particularly over issues like migration. And other parties followed suit at that point of time. And I mean, then the party received 5.7% of the vote. It was not a relevant party for government formation, even though the previous majority conservative government had the majority in the parliamentary period before, between 2006 and 2010. They could still control the plurality of the seats in the parliament and were able to form a viable minority government. You know, in Scandinavian countries, we have had a lot of minority governments that have had support from parties in the parliament. So I think the isolation was not that costly at that point of time. And but it already in 2014 and in 2018, government making became much more complicated. And the reason why the isolation came to an end, not in a very, it gradually came to an end, was of course that it became very difficult to make viable governments. I mean, in 2014, the SD received almost 13% of the votes, 2018, 17% of the vote, and in 2022, it was the second largest party after the Social Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, unless the right-wing parties, the Conservative Party, Moderaterna, the Liberals, the Christian Democrats, were kind of prepared to govern together with the Social Democrats. And you know, the Swedish politics have been a lot about bloc politics. We have had the right against the left in terms of socioeconomic policies. I mean, in order to make a viable government, they would have had to make that kind of cross-block coalition, and that would have been unseen. And of course, it would have been costly, since they would have to compromise a lot on different issues, and they would also be penalized by the voters, competing with one another. So I think ultimately, and what we see from research, is that these isolationist pacts come to an end when, in particular, center-right governments want to form the cabinet, and they are tired of being in opposition, and they are not prepared to form cross-block coalitions. Then these pacts come to an end. And of course, it has been a very difficult situation in the Swedish case, since this pact against the Sweden Democrats were formulated so strongly. I mean, the other party said, well, it has extremist roots, because the Sweden Democrats, they were a neo-Nazi party back then with skinheads. It started as a very extremist parties and then has changed gradually still, I mean, and transformed in different ways. But the other factor was then that immigration policies, they were too radical, too distant from the migration policies of the other parties. But after the 2015 migration situation crisis, I mean, the mainstream parties, the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, they changed the migration policies and they became much more restrictive. Actually, it was the Social Democratic cabinet, Social Democrats governing together with the Green Party, that put in place border controls, replacing permanent residence permits with temporary. I mean, all kinds of restrictive measures in 2015 then were prolonged and then were transformed into a much more restrictive legislation in the Swedish case. So, I mean, the second argument was not kind of really, because the other parties had adapted to SD positions, not being that radical and maybe not using the same type of nationalist argumentation of the importance of national homogeneous population, but they also started framing their immigration policies in a similar way. And I mean, we have a lot of problems with criminality that's due to immigration. We have threats against the welfare, well, not much a welfare state, but some welfare institutions that based in immigration. So they started framing the problems with migration in a similar way as the Sweden Democrats. So you could say that the Swedish democratic policies and framing of migration has been mainstreamed. I mean, you have the Center Party, the Green Party, and the left-wing party that still have not adapted fully or have not adapted to that type of discourse. So you could say that the pact failed or came to an end, because when it's too costly to exclude the radical right party, you include them. I mean, that's part of the equation. And then the second point answer I would give is, well, was it really successful? I mean, it was successful. The isolation was successful in keeping the Sweden Democrats out of government. I mean, now they are not in government, but they are a support party to the government, but with a lot of influence. But I mean, it didn't prevent the party from growing electorally. And it could also make use of its kind of position blackmailing, and an adaptation was ongoing. And in a way, the Sweden Democrats then were able to capitalize and be the issue owner of the migration policies. So what we could see after 2010 was that all other parties liberalized their positions or formulated more liberal positions on migration policies as it was related to the isolation. And the Sweden Democrats were the only party opposing more restrictive immigration policies. And over the last years, we see a more diverse supply of different types of migration policies among the Swedish parties. So I don't know if it was successful or if it failed, but it has taken, and I mean, now still the Sweden Democrats own the question of migration. It's perceived by the voters as the most credible party when it comes to migration policies, and as well as when it comes to criminal policies. So they have issue ownership on issues that can be in a way related to migration.
All right. How do you explain the success of populist parties in the north, namely the Danish People's Party, Sweden Democrats, the True Finns, and the Progress Party of Norway?
You call them the Finns Party. They are called the Finns Party nowadays.
Exactly.
Because initially they were called the True Finns, but now we call them the Finns Party. So why have they been successful? I mean, I'm actually concluding a book now that will come out on Routledge this year on the Nordic radical right. And we start the book by saying, I mean, there has been populism in the Nordic region for a long time, but you talk that you study both left-wing and right-wing and centrist populism. But the first generation of populist parties, that was agrarian populism in Finland, and we have this kind of tax-based protest parties, the progress parties in Norway and Denmark. And then these were kind of their populism was related to socioeconomic issues. But then we have the second generation of populism, and those are then the Sweden Democrats formed in 1988. And then these old populist parties transforming. I mean, the agrarian populist party became the Finns Party, and the Danish Progress Party is a splinter from the Danish Progress Party. And these were formed in 1995, and they were EU skeptical parties, but also the Danish People's Party had anti-immigration as part of their ideological from the beginning, whereas the Finns Party took it on a bit later. I mean, EU was the most important issue for the Finns Party in 2008 and 2009, when they received their first seats in the European Parliament, but also in 2011, when they had this, huge electoral victory, quintupling. I mean, they grew from 4% to 19% of the vote. And so the Progress Party has also taken on immigration since the 90s. So these parties have been transforming, and of course, in a way, resembling other European parties for which migration and EU became the most important issues.
Mm.
So, I mean, they have always been populist, but I think in the Nordic parties, I mean, what has then eased or make it facilitated, of course, we have proportional systems. Sweden has had a higher electoral threshold than the other Nordic countries of 4%, but that doesn't explain the late parliamentary breakthrough of the Sweden Democrats. So I think their ideological legacies, I mean, Sweden Democrats having their origin in extremist environments, explain why it was so difficult for them to kind of become a legitimate party that voters could vote upon, while the other parties had this kind of reputational shield. They had this, you know, they could say that we are populist. The Finns, the predecessor of the Finns party was in government in the 80s, and the Progress parties had different legacies. So, I mean, their historic origin has also facilitated their breakthrough. And of course, I mean, there have been, you could then ask, is there something particular with the Nordic countries as it comes to migration? I mean, they have been known for having, I mean, Sweden at least, having being one of the most, with the highest number of migrants, labor migration in the 60s and 70s, and then other types of migration later, Denmark and Norway as well. So I think, I mean, they have responded to the voters there have responded to the developments that has been going on, and we have seen the other factors. I mean, that there have been a growing distrust towards the mainstream parties. Party identification has become weaker, and of course, I mean, one factor that is mentioned in the Swedish case is, of course, that the social democracy. I mean, the labor voters had for a long time a kind of strong identification with social democracy, and that in a way prevented, but that became much weaker during the last 10-15 years, and that also explains their breakthrough. So I wouldn't say that there is anything particular with the Nordic countries as to the why, but maybe more as to how these parties, when they have become successful, in what ways, and in what ways they, in a way, may differ from other radical right parties in Europe. As it comes to the welfare state, I mean, they have been the strongest advocates of welfare chauvinism. They support the welfare state, but still the Nordic welfare state is universal. It's based on your citizenship, no, not your citizenship or your residence, but then they connect that immigration is a threat to the welfare state. That's one thing. And on the other hand, they have kind of come to see certain Nordic characteristics as part of the Nordic identity in terms of gender equality when it comes to socioeconomic gender equality, kind of parental leave, child care, female employment, while they still are opposed. So they have had, and also to some extent to LGBTQ rights, or LG when it comes to gay rights, not only in terms of female and homo nationalists, but also in terms of accepting same-sex marriage and adoption rights for gay people. So in that way, they have had to adapt to kind of the more secular stances among the people in the Nordic region, most so in Sweden and Norway, less so in Finland and Denmark. Finland and Denmark are in a way more conservative compared to Sweden and Norway on those issues.
All right. What is your assessment of Finns party's performance in Finnish presidential elections? How has it performed in elections compared to other populist parties in the north?
Well, I mean, Finland is apart from Iceland, Finland is the only country having a president. There are two rounds, and Halla-aho, made it. I think he received. Now I don't remember. Did he receive 14% of the votes? I think that was expected. I think even though that the Finns party, I mean, they have accepted the NATO membership. I mean, they did not do that before the Russian invasion in Ukraine. They are also, I mean, strongly opposed to Putin. I mean, they are not like the Russophile parties like FPÖ or AfD in Germany, or even Marine Le Pen and Assemblée Nationale were at some point of time. So, I mean, there is not disagreement on foreign policies and how Finland should react. But of course, I mean, as a radical right wing and also belonging to the more nationalist faction of the Finns party, I mean, that in a way has taken over the Finns party after Timo Soini. Riikka Purra, who now is the leader, is coming from the same environment as Jussi Halla-aho. He has been convicted of hate speech. He has a very, so I don't think a lot of people would see him as a good representative for the entire country. I mean, that's so I think in Finland it's like that it's important for all parties to have their own presidential candidate and to gain visibility and to show that we are there and we can present our policies preparing for municipal elections and national elections. But I mean, it was below it. Of course, it was below their election results in the parliamentary elections last year. Obviously, I mean the result of Halla-aho, and that was not surprising. I think they had a very intense campaign. I mean, he was really targeting young people and particularly using TikTok a lot. I mean, the young Finns, I mean, the youth branch of the young Finns are very active on TikTok, and so are, well, of course, all youth branches. But I mean, here in the presidential campaign, he was really active on TikTok. So he was trying to target younger population.
All right. In your 2023 article for Svenska Dagbladet, you note the global decline of democracy and delve into the potential challenges facing Sweden's democratic system. What key factors do you identify as having the most significant impact on democracy in Sweden? Additionally, how would you evaluate the risk of a democratic breakdown in Sweden in comparison to the global landscape?
Well, I think Sweden is very well I mean, there is general saying that populism is a threat to democracy, but that depends on how kind of consolidated democracy is within each country. So I don't see any immediate threat and for democracy in Sweden due to the SD's kind of status as a support party. I mean, they have proposed legislation that, of course, when it comes to migration, that maybe is not in line with our constitutional law or other regulations or international agreements that Sweden has signed. But I mean, they are not anti-democratic per se. And I mean, it cannot be compared to, I mean, like the US, where you have representatives from Trump or extreme kind of alt-right that are questioning the legitimacy of democracy. I mean, there might be things, I mean, they want to save money on the public broadcasting companies. Then you can ask, is that a threat to democracy? Of course, we need public television and public radio. They have been very strong, and it's also of good quality, like the BBC in Sweden. But of course, it's not kind of the core of the public broadcasting that they want to kind of save on. But of course, I mean, there are tenets, and also they are engaged in cultural politics, but that's also kind of what type of cultural politics should be pursued. I mean, since they are conservative and they want to have cultural politics that are supportive of the state or of the Swedishness and so, but that's the question. I mean, whether that is, I mean, democratic or not. But of course, they are anti-liberal. I mean, that's what they are in a way. And also then anti-liberal, questioning so kind of left-wing liberal ideas when it comes to art and media, sometimes traditions. Also, I mean, we have so, but I wouldn't see that there is any immediate threat. I mean, we have very well functioning, and when it comes to threats towards politicians, I mean, you find those threats more among the extreme right groups and movements that are in Sweden. I mean, that are using violence and that do not support. They would replace the democratic system with another type of system. But you never know. I mean, there are a lot of debates and there are certain things that should be safeguarded. I mean, it's quite easy to change the constitution in Sweden. It should be made more difficult. So there are different types of checks and balances in the system. So but of course there is a broader range of policy alternatives now, and of course I don't know if you could call it polarization. So, and if that is a democratic threat or no, I don't know. But still, I mean, there is great support for and then of course, I mean, the Nordic states have been, in Sweden, they have been high trusting societies, and now trust is decreasing. And we can also see that, but if that is related to the kind of societal situation that we have around us with criminality and with war going on and everything, I mean, that's difficult to say. But I mean, it would be really overstated to single out kind of a radical right party as the threat to democracy in these times. Yeah.
All right. Given your research focus on right-wing radical parties, how do you assess the influence of parties such as Sweden Democrats on the core tenets of democracy, particularly in relation to their stances on migration, integration, and law enforcement? How have SD's role in Swedish politics and their positions affected the political landscape in Sweden?
Yeah, well, as I said previously, I mean, this is the new mainstream. I mean, the other parties have adopted to these positions, not completely, but they are closest. So the adaptation started after the refugee crisis in 2015. I mean, then the other parties, as I said, the government, then immediately, I mean, there were 160,000 asylum seekers to Sweden by the autumn of 2015. And then they formulated this temporary law, and then the parties started modifying their own policy positions on migration, on integration, and criminal policy. And everything is going in a restrictive direction. I mean, Denmark was, of course, the first out, and Denmark as you know, has opt-out from EU migration policies. So they have the most restrictive positions of all the Nordic countries. But now, since I mean, now all the Nordic countries have very similar policies as it comes to migration. I have written a report together with a research colleague, Jonas Hinfors, on where we are kind of covering the restrictive turn in migration policies in the Nordic region during the last 20 years. And now they are very similar to one another. And of course, I mean, you have this factor that that's the perception among the political parties, that if a country has more liberal policies on migration in particular, also on integration, that will be kind of a pull factor. And so everyone is kind of saying, well, we can't have more liberal migration policies than our neighboring countries. So we have really seen a race to the bottom on migration policies, and also kind of resembling a lot what's going on in the EU, but in the Nordic countries in particular. So of course, and as I answered earlier, also as to the framing, I mean, what's the problem? Why do we have criminality? Why is there? What is the threat to welfare states? I mean, they also tell these stories that, well, it's immigration, and now I don't know if you know, but the Social Democratic Party, they firstly presented a report, was it before Christmas, where they explained why the Social Democratic Party had failed with their immigration policies, and that it was a mistake. They had formulated two liberal migration policies. And now recently, the party leader, Magdalena Andersson, there was a debate saying that, well, I mean, the Social Democratic Party has always been in favor for kind of restrictive and kind of responsible migration policies. And that's in a way through. Back, when the Yugoslavia imploded, I mean, we had a similar debate on very restrictive migration policies. So there have been kind of cycles, but then it was not this kind of general debate on that, we should have restrictive migration policies. I mean, the problem is, of course, labor migration. And in particular in Finland, that is a problem. Sweden has a lot of labor that's not employed for different reasons. But for some countries, I mean, so they try to balance. So they have asylum seeking, family reunification, greater hurdles, you have to pay more to come in, and also when it to integration, you have maybe to seek a job, there are more kind of demands made for migration, language requirements, tests for kind of societal education. Kids have to go to kindergarten to learn the questions. So there are much more kind of, and this is of course double-sided. Of course, it's important that migrant kids goes to kindergarten and learn Swedish, because otherwise they will have difficulties in school, they will have difficulties on studying and getting out into labor force. So you could, I mean, it's double, but you see really kind of a convergence among parties on issues. And as I said earlier, I mean, it's the left-wing party, the Green Party, and the Center Party that have maintained more liberal positions, but all the other parties have moved in a restrictive direction.
All right. In the Svenska Dagbladet article, you discuss right-wing populist parties portraying themselves as democracy saviors. What is your perspective on this claim? Are there instances where such parties have genuinely strengthened democracy? Populism is often negatively charged. How do you see the interplay between populism and democracy? And can populism serve as a democratic reset?
Well, it's this debate. I mean, is populism, and now I talk then radical right-wing parties, populist, radical right-wing populist. Is it a threat to democracy? And then we think about their illiberalism and prejudice against migration, they hate speech. I mean, how they can kind of infringe on kind of basic human rights and also, of course, in some ways also question some democratic institutions. And as I said, I see these parties more as critical of liberal democracy and not of democracy. They have their own idea about democracy. But I mean, and then we talk about exclusionary and inclusionary populism. I suppose you are very well familiar with this. And of course, these radical right wings are exclusionary populists. But what they have been doing, at least I mean, I would say both in Northern Nordic countries. I mean, they have, particularly in Finland and Sweden, those are the countries I know the best, but I mean, I know the other. So, I mean, they have given voice to citizens that hold anti-immigration attitudes. I mean, then we know, of course, that it's an interplay, and in that way, they have contributed to better representation. I mean, to the EU issues. In Finland, before the Finns party, there was no party that was really kind of voicing an anti-skeptical position. I mean, during the Euro crisis. And I mean, when Finland joined the European Monetary Union, I mean, there was a 5-party coalition. All parties were supportive of Finland joining the European Monetary Union. So there was not a lot of criticism against it. It was really an elite-driven process. So in that way, I mean, populism has contributed to a debate and also to the mobilization of that issue, and proposing a supply where there has been a demand for EU skepticism. And then, of course, there have been events, I mean, the Euro crisis and the migration crisis and things that happen around that have given these parties possibilities to talk about their core issues. But I would say the same as to migration. I mean, that was they have given voice to people who are more critical towards migration. I mean, not all voters are xenophobes. I mean, but they have restrictive views on migration. Of course, there are xenophobic people too among those who vote on these parties. So I see. I mean, and you can see that when we study, I mean, support for democracy or political satisfaction or satisfaction with democracy and satisfaction with influence, you can see that these voters that are more dissatisfied, less trusting of democracy and politicians, their support increases when their parties made it to the parliament or when they are acting as support parties to government. So you could say in that way they can be correctives, even though we might not like all their what they propose.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is concern that populist right-wing radical parties may secure a quarter of the mandates in the upcoming European Union elections. How do you anticipate this impacting the political landscape within the European Union?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, the dynamics of the European Parliament will change. Ultimately, that depends on what types of parliamentary groups will be formed. I mean, there are still two groups, ID and ECR, and the question is whether the pattern we have seen in the member states, where center-right parties cooperate with the radical right, if that will be the case in the European Parliament as well. I mean, EPP cooperating with ECR, but maybe not with the ID, or if the ECR and ID will cooperate. I mean, that's, and depending on those dynamics, their influence will be and their impact on the decision making within the European Parliament will differ. So, but of course, they will grow. I think that's kind of a prognosis we can make. And add to that, I would say, I mean, the radical right parties have, of course, a lot more influence over the Council of Ministers and different constellations of that, because they are members in a lot of governments. Italy, I mean, Finland, support party in Sweden, we don't, and in some Central and Eastern Europeans. So, I mean, the dynamics in the European Parliament, in the European Union has changed already. But of course, when they are growing the European Parliament, there will be a different type of dynamic as well, because when we have these co-decision procedures and collaboration. So,
all right. And the last question, how do you assess the potential impact of global political collaboration among right-wing radical parties, especially in the light of potential return of Donald Trump to power in the upcoming fall? What could be the nature of populist political challenges globally in the wake of a second Trump mandate in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that the European radical right is divided over Russia already. I mean, and that could almost be kind of the line of division between ID and ECR. I mean, that was the reason, one of the reasons, but I think an important reason for the Finns party to transfer from the ID to the ECR last year after the parliamentary elections. And of course, that's as well due to that the Finns party is the closest international ally is the Sweden Democrats. But I think Trump, I mean, and with the really kind of, if you could call it radicalization of Trump and what he's saying and his attitude towards Russia and Putin, I think it would be more problematic for the European right-wing parties to take kind of a very clear stance in favor of Trump. We can see here, I mean, of the Nordic parties, it's the Sweden Democrats that have cultivated their links with US during the last 5 to 6 years. So they have established contacts with kind of Republican think tanks, organizations, closely connected to being Trump supporters, and they have learned. I mean, they have learned a lot, and that's also. I mean, they have created these links through ECR. I mean, that's the way. But of course, it has always been problematic with. I mean, they have been asked. I mean, they have, the Sweden Democrats have had close contacts with Hungary. And they have also been interviewed about Orban, what they think about Orban. And it's difficult to say. I mean, and of course, we don't know what role Orban will have in any type of European parliamentary setting. And I think the same with Trump. I mean, if you go to a Sweden Democratic meeting or any Nordic radical right party kind of meeting, you will see people having kind of Trump, these kind of hats and so. But I think it's problematic for the leadership. So I wouldn't say that there would be some kind of immediate close connection, saying, well, we have won. The Nordic parties have been condemning kind of the I mean, kind of not questioning, when they are questioning the electoral institutions, not accepting, talking about electoral fraud. And so, I mean, that has not been an easy piece for these parties to accept. I mean, they have really voiced criticism, and depending on what's happening, I think it could be as difficult. I mean, it would be a divisive issue, as well as Putin and Trump would be the new person to be divided upon.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, I think it will affect a lot. I think the radical right parties will be emboldened by Trump, a possible Trump victory.
Yeah, but I think it depends on what type of. I think it would be different for different radical right parties. I mean, you see the same with Russia and Putin. I mean, for the Nordic radical right parties, it would be impossible to support Putin. They want to secure that the European Union still is supporting Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. It would be impossible for them to propose any kind of pro. I mean, you have the more extreme right parties. They could do it, but not the mainstream. That would be impossible. And I remember you had a question how we could understand that they have been supporting the refugees from the Ukraine.
Yes, indeed. We didn't have much time.
What?
So I skipped that question, but you can answer in a few minutes.
Yeah, because no, but I mean it's the same. I mean, their framing of the question is that they see these are real refugees. I mean, they are fleeing from war, while many now in quotation marks they see other refugees coming from Middle East or Syria. They are economic refugees. They are not real refugees. And then secondly, the Ukrainians are expected to return back home when the war is over. So that's the second argument. So that's how they have been able to welcome migration from Ukraine, but not from other parts of the world. And of course, now I listened to radio this morning. So now they are preparing, the Swedish government is preparing kind of a package how to then help Ukrainians to go back when the war is over, if it gets over. And there was some saying that the European Union is interested in how they are going to what type of policies they will pursue.
All right.
So they will not be able to stay. And so Sweden has had very low support to the Ukrainians. I mean, they have not have the right to go to Swedish education. And that's, I mean, because then they are not integrated and they don't learn Swedish. But now, I mean, as the war continues, I mean, I mean, they are needed. I mean, there is a shortage of labor. So, I mean, and these people are very well educated, and many of them, there are a lot of civil society organizations that have presented language education in other ways. And now municipalities have financed language education for the Ukrainian refugees.
All right. Professor Jungar, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.